Hey everyone. So today we're going to be talking about a term that is used in a lot of counseling circles. It's used in a lot of books. It's used in a lot of pop culture references. And it's the word true self. It's the idea of finding your true self. And sometimes when people hear this term, certainly older generations, they kind of roll their eyes and feel a little nauseated by this whole concept of finding your true self because it's often associated with young people gallivanting off to Europe for 6 months, spending lots of money, only to come back with some really cool Instagram photos. But the truth is, there is a lot of beauty to this idea of finding the true self. And it's important to kind of understand what counselors mean, what books mean, what culture means when we're talking about our true self. Now, the true self really exists in a lot of different areas of our life. Professionally, there can be a true self that you need to find. Emotionally, there can be a true self you need to find. And then existentially, there's a true self you need to find. So today we're going to be talking about what this true self term and idea actually means. And so let's jump into it. First thing to know about the true self is that it really birthed out of this concept called the false self, which is this whole idea that culture, expectations, obligations, and even things like trauma can create this version of ourselves that really isn't who we are. And by who we are, I mean kind of who we are really on the inside. Probably the most familiar and classic example of your false self not being your true self is the individual who gets into business because their parents kind of thought that becoming an artist was a very poor choice for a career. Another example would be somebody who marries one kind of person instead of another kind of person because their parents or society says, this person's a better person to marry than this other person. That's a concept we see in a lot of love movies regularly. But honestly, when it comes to where we are at, where you are at personally, finding your true self usually exists in these three categories of your profession, emotionally, and then existentially. And so professionally, a lot of us can fall into jobs where we aren't really living into our purpose, we're not really living into our potential. Oftentimes, we can fall into careers that aren't really who we are because we're believing things about ourselves that isn't really true, like I'm not that smart, I can't really be a leader, I can't really solve complex problems, so let me just kind of settle for this job, let me kind of settle for this career. But then emotionally, we struggle with finding our true self all the time. I think a really classic example of this would be somebody who looks like they're happy all the time. And you often kind of wonder yourself, how are you happy all the time? How are you positive and optimistic all the time? And then the news comes out that they ended up having some real issues they were kind of secretly holding on to, or some real challenges they weren't really letting people into, and you come to find that the kind of happy exterior was a little bit of a facade. And in that case, that would be a perfect example of these obligations and these expectations. Society has done a pretty good job at telling us that we can't really have a problem, that if you have a problem, you're kind of a liability, so stop being a liability and get your crap together, which leads a lot of us into this false self, this non-true version of ourselves emotionally, where we're kind of acting and behaving and pretending to kind of be someone we really aren't. Existentially, we can actually also fall into this false self instead of our true self when we answer the big questions of life. When we answer the big questions of life with answers that don't really reflect how we actually feel. And this can happen in everything from spirituality. There's a lot of people who are into certain spiritual paths, into certain spiritual lifestyles that they've kind of been taught or that they've been inherited, but they never really answer the question for themselves. What do they believe about the universe? What do they believe about what happens after death? What do they believe about right and wrong? Existentially, though, you can also get into things like, the kind of relationships you want to have, the kind of purpose you want to have in your life. And these are other questions and other issues that we can also fall into a false version of if we haven't really identified this true self and what it means to have a true self. So in summary, the true self is really this idea of getting at who you really are and stripping away the expectations and the obligations, and honestly, in some cases, the unawareness, because there's a lot of situations where people are just unaware that they're living out this false version of themselves, which actually can create a lot of problems. You can meet people who are very unhappy, who are very confused, who are very pessimistic and melancholy, and honestly, what's happening is they haven't really gotten in touch with who they really are. They're still kind of living towards culture's expectations or parents' expectations or other people's expectations. And so in this idea of the true self that counselors are talking about, that books are talking about, that culture is talking about, we're trying to get at this version of who you really are once you kind of strip away all the masks and the distractions and the obligations and the expectations. And so I hope that kind of helps you to kind of understand this idea of the true self. And please feel free to share this video with anybody who has also kind of been asking you this question. What does the true self really mean? I've heard this, my counselor said this, I've heard this in culture. And so I hope as you kind of journey into finding your true self, that it's a positive experience, that you really do uncover more of who you really are. And thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.